Welcome back. Thank you for joining us for another episode. I'm joined by Chris. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks, Jake.
And today we're going to be talking about a fairly new study which has really interesting implications for some ways that you guys might be training in the gym. So we're going to be talking about fatigue. We're going to be talking about the effects of fatigue. And we're going to talk a little bit about fatigue in a sense that is going to be new for, I suspect, everyone listening. And there's going to be some implications that some of you will be aware of. And there's going to be some new implications that you might actually adjust what you're doing in the gym based off this. So it's going to be a fun conversation. There's going to be a lot coming out of it. But before we get there, I have a training plan to discuss with you all. Now, this training plan is an old school one. This is silver era in its finest. So here we've got a 1950 plan by Henry Paschal. Now, this was, I don't know if you, Chris, are you familiar with Henry Paschal?
I've not come across Henry Paschal.
I suspect you would like him. He was a comic book, what would you call it? A cartoonist, I guess.
Cartoonist, okay.
And so he had a comic strip called Bosco. And so Bosco was kind of like his alter ego. So Pascal was involved with Hoffman. We've talked about Bob Hoffman, York Barbell, and a lot of those sort of early silver era kind of weightlifters. And so Bosco was Pascal's sort of, alter ego kind of character who was like a kind of your classic bronze era lifter. So he was just strong man, big puffed out chest. He was a German kind of strong man and very funny cartoons. So Pascal was, he wrote a lot about weightlifting as well. And so this workout comes from a training log, a training book that he published, which I think touched on sort of like some of this Bosco stuff and some of his own personal training. And so this was a plan that he was following at the time in 1950. And he talked about this as a plan that he used simply because he didn't have time to do anymore. This was his sort of efficiency, busy person plan, how to get the most results out of, I guess, the minimal time investment. And these are still decently long sessions. He said it took him about an hour to hour and a half. So these are not super short sessions by any stretch of the imagination. But obviously at this time, 1950, we had people like Steve Reeves who were doing some, marathon 2-hour plus workout sessions. So this sort of hour and a half is potentially half of what some of these other silver era lifters are doing. Now, again, 1950, so we are going to see some exercises here that are pretty old school and that maybe did drop off in the coming decades. So we have been talking about some later plans over the last few episodes. And, we've talked about some new exercises that started to make their way in over the last few episodes. And you'll see some old exercises appearing here. So we have 12 exercises, which again was kind of the norm for a lot of the silver era. And we have single sets. And again, that was an efficiency thing. And we start with he kind of talked about this as like a warming up exercise. So I don't think he was using a lot of load with this exercise. It was a squat and he was using holding a barbell in an overhead position. So overhead squat. And again, he did 8 repetitions with it. Wasn't particularly intended to be a hypertrophy exercise. Then we go into a barbell curl. So we've got 2-hand barbell curl sets of 8. So 1 set of 8. And then go into a seated swing bar curl. Now, I think we have talked about swing bar curls in the past. I think Grimmick maybe talked about them. And so this is not an exercise you see done today. It's not an exercise you hear anyone talk about. Essentially, it's a seated barbell curl, and you're holding this special apparatus with a fairly close grip between your legs. So it's almost like it'd be like doing a seated close grip barbell curl, essentially. So he does 1 set of 15 repetitions with that. And then he goes into what he calls the Bosco deadlift and shrug. Now, silver era, so it's nice to see this type of exercise here. Essentially, the way this exercise was done was a stiff leg deadlift, and then in the top position, they did a shrug. So I think he would have gone off blocks, but he didn't return to the blocks or the floor between each repetition. It was like a standard stiff leg with a shrug at the top, and that was done for a set of 10. And then we go into a incline barbell press. And he said sometimes he would do this with dumbbells instead, or you could do it with a barbell, and that was a set of 10. And then we have a triceps exercise. Now I'm going to read out the description he gives of this exercise. So try to visualize this. It's a bit of a funny one. And again, it's not one I've seen anyone do. I've done it a few times myself. I think we've talked about possibly this exercise when we talked about Sig Klein in a really early episode. But the way he explains this exercise, he calls it a triceps exercise with dumbbell. And you would take a pair of dumbbells, and they wouldn't be very heavy dumbbells, and you would bend forward from the hips. So I guess you're in almost like the end of a good morning position. And then you would brace yourself, and then with your arms hanging down and keeping your arms straight, so you're not bending the elbow, you would then bring your arms directly behind your back. And he would say you do that until you get that cramping kind of sensation at the top. So that very shortened position. And then that was it. You'd return to the starting position and you go again. Now, he would do 15 repetitions with this. And personally, when I've experimented with this exercise, it's very difficult to do this with a heavier load or for lower repetitions. And I suspect that's probably why he was using high reps here. Then he went into a barbell squat, and he was doing the 20 rep squat, which was obviously very common at this time. I don't know if he was pausing between repetitions. I have a feeling towards the end he would. So there's different ways of doing this. We've talked about the 20 rep squat in the past. Some people would do a few breaths between each repetition. Other people would get towards the end of the set, say, rep 10 to 15, and then start implementing the pauses. I think he did it that second way. And then we go into what he called the Bosco chest lifting breathing exercise. Now, again, as was normal at this point, people would often do the 20 rep squat, and then they would do a barbell pullover. And, they believed it was expanding the rib cage and making the chest bigger and whatever else. And they often wouldn't use a lot of load with that. Now, he talks about using this Bosco chest lifting exercise instead of the pullover. And again, I'm going to have to explain this one to you because it's a bit of a weird one. So he would be in a squat position, and he would have the bar. So the bar would be in the squat rack, okay? So now he wouldn't put the bar on his back, but you would have the bar set up. And then what he would do is have his hands placed on the bar behind him. So he's standing in front of the bar, and then lean forwards until he felt the stretch. And then he would push into the bar, and he said his chest would lift as he's pushing into the bar. And he would do these 20 sort of isometric pushes down into the bar and lifting his chest each time. Now, I don't know if you get anything out of that. I tried to visualize this and think about what this is doing, and I didn't come up with anything, but I'll leave it to you in a moment. So we're almost done. Then we've got, where were we after our chest lifting exercise? We've got a what he called a pull-up with a barbell. Now, this is essentially like an upright row. So he's pulling the bar up to chin height and then back down. So kind of what we would just call an upright row now. And then side bends with the dumbbell, which didn't really continue on past early Silver era. We talked about this in the last few episodes. They did exist up until sort of, I guess, around the 50s, early 50s. And then they sort of fell out of fashion after that, but he was still doing them. And he did that for a set of 10. And then he finished, two more. Then he did a leg press, which would have been, I suspect, with a barbell balanced on his feet, most likely. I'm not sure if he had a machine. At that point in time, most people didn't. And he didn't actually mention repetitions, but he did say that it wasn't overly heavy. So I'm assuming probably 15, 20 repetitions like the exercises prior. And then he concluded with a Bosco Zottman exercise. Now, people might be familiar with the Zottman curl. We haven't talked about this, I don't believe. So the Zottman curl is a type of biceps dumbbell curl. And essentially, for people who aren't familiar with it, what you would do is you would stand normally. You'd have two dumbbells, so a dumbbell on each side, in each hand. And you would alternate. So one hand would come up, and you'd be coming up in a supinated position, a supinated wrist position. And then when you get to the top, you would pronate while the other hand comes up in a supinated position. So you're kind of doing, a supinated concentric and then a pronated eccentric. Now, this would be done I don't know if you've seen videos of people doing this, Chris, but it was like quite rhythmic. It was sort of this like circular flowing type exercise, and he would do 40 repetitions with it. Now, often you hear or you see people doing Zottman curls today, they don't particularly look the way these guys used to do it. Again, it very much looked like this kind of almost like a dance. It's a very rhythmic type exercise. But let me finish there. There's a few novel exercises. What's standing out to you?
Okay, so trying to think about this logically. So we've got the overhead squat as a warm-up. Okay, fine. We've also got the heavy squat kind of, or the 20 rep max, or the 10 rep max with 20 reps, or however they're doing it, breathing squats or whatever. And then obviously we've got the leg press. So that's a lot of squat pattern in there, but obviously only single sets per exercise. So there's like a warm-up style overhead squat, and then there's a proper squat session, and then there's a leg press finishing it off. I mean, very much a duplication from my point of view, really. And then we've got the same thing, really, with the curls. So we've got 3 curl variations as well. We've got the starting barbell curl, we've got the swing bar curl, and then we've got the Zottman curl at the end. So again, and maybe there's a little bit of difference there, but I don't think there's a lot of difference.
No.
So straight away, I've got what looks like 3 sets of a basic squat pattern, and then 3 sets of a basic kind of standing curl pattern with a little bit of variation, not very much in either of those situations. So I'm seeing here something that I don't like. And I've been very vocal about saying that I don't like this. It's when people vary stuff, but they're not actually varying anything important. So this is the appearance of variety without the actual reality of biomechanical variety. So straight away, he's getting on my wrong side, because he's doing something I don't like seeing, which is varying something for the sake of appearances rather than for the sake of actual differences.
Now, to play devil's advocate for one moment there, I understand what he's saying with the curls. I understand that, yes, you could have very easily selected a reverse curl, or the Zottman curl he's doing is not the most efficient way of doing that. But when it comes to the quads, assuming he didn't have access to iron boots, then he was quite limited with what he could do for quads, right? And one thing that I actually do like doing in my own programming is I'm not against giving someone effectively 2 exercises that are the same. Like here we've got the squat and the leg press. It's the same, basically. I'm not against giving them both of those exercises for a single set, as opposed to giving them 2 sets of one of those, because I do find that single set effect, someone's going to perform better from a motivational standpoint than doing 2 sets of the same exercise.
And I think that's probably fair where you're talking about machine exercises. I think where you're talking about requiring setup time for things like squats, I think the argument goes away, because you're going to have so much warm up and prep and getting ready and making sure everything's all right before you do the actual work set that you lose an enormous amount of that energy and motivation that you would get if you were just doing machine for single sets. In single set for machines, I totally agree with you. If you've got 2 machines that do broadly the same thing, but you can mentally get yourself in a place where you treat them as separate things, then fantastic. But this is where we're setting up overhead squats and then actual squats, and then leg presses where you're balancing a barbell on your feet. I think you're losing a lot by doing that. Those 3 set processes.
Yeah. I mean, arguably the 20 rep squat, like you said, it's, potentially 10, 15 rep max weight might not be too much setup. But in general, I agree with you, especially
probably
like that
is though in his case,
exercise.
because he probably doesn't have a squat rack.
Yeah, he may have been sort of what do you call that? Is it a Steinberg squat where you get it up from the side?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of hard work in there that I think makes no sense to me at all. Also, I'm not wild about his choice of the lateral delt exercise, middle delt exercise, which is basically his upright row, because again, he's using biceps in that exercise. Why would you choose when you could literally just do lateral raises or dumbbell, frontal plane
why
presses?
Are you adding in the elbow?
Why are you adding yet more biceps work when you've already got 3 separate biceps exercises in there? So again, I'm not wild about that as a choice. I think that makes very little sense. The pressing exercise is fine. No complaints about that. I'm not seeing any kind of lat work in here, really. I don't see any pull-ups. I don't see any rows. The closest we've got to anything that trains the back is the deadlift and shrug.
Yeah.
So, and I'm happy to see a stiff leg in there, and I'm happy to see a shrug in there, because those two things that tend to drop out in many of the bronze era programs. So ultimately, or bronze and silver actually, we tend to lose that. So I'm happy to see hamstrings working here. I'm happy to see shrugs in there for the traps, but I'm not seeing any lat work in here at all. But then, to be fair, I've criticised many silver era programs on that basis as well.
I like that deadlift shrug exercise he's got in there.
And again, with it being stiff leg and potentially from blocks, I think that can be a fantastic bodybuilding movement. I think you're getting a lot of, again, if you're in a hurry and you've got limited equipment, I think it's a fantastic option. I mean, really, if I've done before I kind of move on to something that I think would do 90% of this with minimal time input, let me just kind of look at this thing that you've described as a triceps exercise. So just to be clear, he's not actually doing elbow extension.
Correct.
So it's actually a shoulder extension exercise.
Yes.
So it's essentially starting with the easiest part of the motion if he's bending forwards in a good morning type position, and essentially his arm is downwards, and it's at 90 degrees. And getting it moving from that 90 degrees is really easy, because essentially the external moment arm at that point is relatively small.
Tiny.
So it's the exercise getting harder and harder and harder as he goes to the end range of motion.
Yeah.
So triceps, shoulder, or long head of the triceps is a shoulder extensor, but its best leverage is overhead. So it drops to 0 as you get to the 90-degree point, and essentially that is where or just past that point, where you're finishing. So this isn't a triceps exercise. This is going to be closer to a posterior delt and thoracic lat exercise, really. So this is the closest thing you're going to get to a lat exercise in that program, and it's definitely not a triceps exercise. Triceps exercise will be if the hardest part of the exercise was overhead in a pullover type position. So I guess whatever he's replaced, I actually don't think the exercise that he's replacing a pullover with is actually a pullover. I think it's something completely different. But
yeah,
the exercise selection here makes it very difficult to analyze. I'm kind of going around in circles trying to figure out what actually this program is doing.
Yeah, because even what you said there, like, okay, is he actually potentially getting some lat work then with his?
Yeah, well, that's why straight away I'm contradicting myself, because I'm like, well, I saw no lat work, and now I'm realizing the triceps exercise is actually lat work.
Yeah.
And then if I look hard enough at this chest lifting breathing exercise, maybe I'll find something in there.
Yeah, who knows? I know. I was honestly, when I was looking at that, I'm like, what are we getting? This must be something we're getting, but
it looks a little bit like it might be a slightly wider grip than shoulder flexion, so outside of the sagittal plane, but it's not transverse plane. So it's not out here, it's somewhere down here, I think, from what you described to me.
Yeah.
But that would kind of make it like a pec exercise, a clavicular pec exercise probably, which fits the description in this particular case, although obviously, as we've seen, whether something fits the description isn't necessarily a guarantee. So it looks to me like it's just another press, really, or a clavicular press. So, in that sense, it fits with it adds on to the pressing volume that he's got, which is not, very much. So I'm struggling really to get my head around this as a thing. There's lots of stuff I don't like about it, but there's a couple of things that I really do like. Honestly, I would constrain this right down. I would cut this right back. If he was writing this, today with the same equipment limitations, I would be like, obviously we both think the deadlift and shrug variation is a fantastic option, but yeah, stiff legs, I think is a fantastic choice if you've got nothing more than a barbell. Obviously shrug, if you can do that at the same time, okay. If you can't, then you can do it separately. Squats, obviously you're going to be doing that because there's no real other choice in terms of training the lower body hip and knee extension function without that. Obviously, he's got a bench, so he can do bench presses. If he genuinely doesn't have access to a pull-up bar, then okay, so pulling is going to be difficult, but he could do some row variation.
Yeah, it is interesting that he doesn't have a row in there. Obviously, that was very commonly done. So I wonder what the
just do a bent over row. I hate those, but you could do a bent over row.
Yeah.
You could set up the bench to do a. If you put the bench on blocks, you can do a horizontal row from the floor. And you can do that sagittal plane. You can do it more wide grip and get a wide grip version as well.
There's just so many wasted exercises here with the
and then
biceps
you obviously
work.
Do curls with the just so much ridiculous biceps work that's probably not doing very much. And then a bunch of strange things that don't make a lot of sense. But I think you could squat, deadlift, bench press and a row, and the shrug obviously, and I think you'd have a really solid exercise routine in 5 exercises that's doing almost everything that he's got here.
Yeah, that's valid.
I mean, really, when we've got access to machines, we start putting in stuff like, okay, so he could technically do a calf raise. He could stand with a barbell and he could do a calf raise. Not nice, but he could do that. But generally speaking, when we start adding in machines, we're getting stuff like rec fem, we're getting better hamstrings work, we're getting more options in terms of cables and start moving activation around between regions. So we get the variety that he's struggling to get. But even in the context of the equipment that he's got available to him, I think he's got a lot of fluff in here that doesn't really make any sense. Got a lot of duplication in here that doesn't make any sense. And ultimately, you could do a better job with 5 exercises, in my opinion.
What I do like about it, I do like the single sets, and I do like the fact that when he is training a muscle group with more than one set, he's choosing to do an additional exercise for that instead of an additional set. I do like that.
Sure.
I do like that most of this is sort of in that 8 to 10 repetition range. Yes, there's some that go up to 15, some that even go up to 20. I actually quite like the fact that he's not wed to just one of those repetitions, because that's where I would choose to train as well. If there's some exercises where I know I don't need to do any additional warm-up sets and I can do a set of 8 or set of 6 or whatever, I'll do that. And there's others where that's not feasible and I'll do a set of 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever it might be. So I think that's convenient. But, and 12 exercises. I think a lot of people do quite well with about 12 exercises in a workout.
Nothing magical though about 12.
No, it's not magical.
If 7 of them are duplications.
No, I know. But as a outline of a training program, if you took out the exercises and you changed the exercises up, the actual foundational outline I think is quite good. But yes, the exercise selection leaves a fair bit wanting, doesn't it?
It does.
So, moving on, we're talking about fatigue, which we have talked about multiple times. We're talking about it from a different perspective today.
We are, because there is a study that came out at the end of last year that I've only recently sort of had the time to go through, and been very excited to read it. Just to set the context, there's obviously a couple of things I want to say about context, but the first thing I want to say about context here is that this is a rodent study. So if you're listening to this and you think that rodent studies aren't relevant, you can stop listening. In fact, you probably shouldn't be listening to this podcast at all. But, anyway, if you generally think that rodent studies aren't interesting or that they're of some kind of minor relevance in comparison with long-term human studies, then again, as I say, you can stop listening. But this is a rodent study that has attempted to solve a fundamental problem about hypertrophy. It's asking a fundamental question. It's not tinkering around the edges. It's not asking questions that aren't striking at the heart of how hypertrophy actually happens. It's going right to the very center of the questions that we're interested in, and it's saying, how does this actually work if I control all of these other variables that I'm, kind of interested in? Now, this is only very rarely done. So let me just kind of give a little bit of very quick background to the situation. But essentially, we've got, I think this is the third in a series of really important studies that have actually tried to get fundamental information about how hypertrophy works. The first study is one that I'm always talking about. It's an incredibly important study. It's called Increased Hypertrophic Response with Increased Mechanical Load in Skeletal Muscles Receiving Identical Activity Patterns. That was published in 2016, and it's one of the fundamental studies behind why I keep pointing out to people that force-velocity relationship is the underlying principle behind mechanical tension that drives hypertrophy and muscular contractions. Because what it did was it had two groups of rodents, one that trained with isometrics and one that trained with an identical amount of activation but with high velocity contractions, so isokinetics. So essentially, you're using electrical stimulation to make sure that muscle activation is absolutely maximal and identical in all of the contractions that you're doing in the training program, and you match that activation between the two groups. The only difference is the force that the fibers produce because of the force-velocity relationship. And what they found was that the high force, the isometric group, achieved quite a lot of hypertrophy, whereas the high velocity group achieved almost no hypertrophy. But fiber type shifting was identical in both of those two groups. And that's really, really important because what it shows you is that mechanical tension from the force velocity relationship is driving the hypertrophic response, the actual fiber growth, single fiber growth, whereas activation is driving fiber type shifting. So I keep telling people calcium ions drive fiber type shifting. Well, there's another kind of sort of item in the list of things that adds to that conclusion. So this was a really, really fundamental, I think this is the fundamental hypertrophy study because it shows you that not only is hypertrophy a single fiber phenomenon, but it's actually driven by things that are happening inside fiber relating obviously to the force velocity relationship, the binding of actin and myosin. So massively, massively important study, not just another rodent study, but possibly the rodent study when it comes to hyper. Second study then is the volume study. So this is like exactly the same idea. You electrically stimulate muscles in rodents for a period of a couple of weeks. And what you're doing there is you're just testing whether or not you're getting the same kind of hypertrophy with different contraction modes. And essentially this study showed that you could do essentially the same volume of contractions in different contraction modes and get exactly the same muscle growth. That is the studies that was published in 2017. That study is called Effects of Contraction Mode and Stimulation Frequency on Electrical Stimulation-Induced Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy. Really, really important study, basically telling us that contraction mode doesn't really matter if you get the same kind of torque time integrals. Now, I would argue that your eccentrics are going to give you more sarcomatogenesis in that context, and your isometrics and concentrics are going to give you more myofibrillar addition in that context, but fundamentally the total muscle volume growth is going to be the same in those cases. So another really, really critical study for understanding exactly how hypertrophy is happening. And this final study in the three is one, as I say, that was published just at the end of last year. And this study is basically looking at how fatigue modifies that dose-response relationship. So it's called Effects of Repetition Duration on Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy in a Rat Model of Resistance Exercise. Published just this year, although, as I say, technically it was available right at the back end of 2025. Now, that was my context for the literature. So if you're interested in this from an exercise science point of view and history of exercise science, and the longer I do this job and the longer I think about this stuff and the older I get, the more I become interested in how exercise science changes over time and the history of this process. That's just, I guess, a kind of byproduct of just being here a long time. So the other context, though, is what are we actually talking about with this study? Now, I'll get into the details and I'll explain what the study did in a moment, but I just want to, again, put a kind of notice at the top of this section, like I put a notice at the beginning of the last section to say, if you're interested, if you don't think rodent studies are important, then you can leave. At this point, I'm going to make the notice that if you are listening to what I'm saying over the next 10, 20 minutes and you start to think that I'm talking about time under tension or doing repetitions with different speeds, so slowing down the repetition, then you aren't understanding what I'm saying. This is not about, I know the title says repetition duration. This is not about repetition duration. I'll explain why that is in a moment. But fundamentally, what we're talking about here is the negative effect of fatigue mechanisms on the hypertrophic stimulus that we're experiencing because of the reduction in mechanical tension that those fatigue mechanisms create. So that is the essence of this investigation. It's saying, if I have identical talk time integrals, but within those talk time integrals, some of the groups are experiencing fatigue mechanisms, do I end up with the same hypertrophy or do I end up with different hypertrophy? Is it essentially affected by the presence of those calcium ion fatigue mechanisms? But we'll get into that shortly. So what did the study actually do? Well, basically, they had 3 different groups of rodents training for 4 weeks, and they did electrically stimulated contraction training, which means that you're getting maximal or the equivalent of maximal recruitment. So you can imagine that in a human situation, this would be like doing maximum voluntary isometric contractions 3 times a week for 4 weeks, or probably longer in the case of humans, because we tend to need much longer studies to get the same level of statistical significance that we would get in rodents. So you can imagine that if you did this in a human trial, you'd be looking at 8 weeks, probably 3 times a week training, maximal isometric contractions. And they have 3 training groups, and they all aimed to produce the same talk time integrals, which is essentially like saying you're getting the same amount of force over time or area under the curve that force is generating. And one group did, just to be clear, all groups are training with sets of 10 contractions, 10 isometric contractions. One group's training with 1 second duration contractions, one group's training with 3 second duration contractions, and a third group is training with 9 second duration contractions. Remember, these are all maximal isometric contractions with electrical stimulation, so you're kind of hitting the muscle as if it were a stimulating rep kind of context in this sort of strength training situation. To keep talk time integrals the same, the 1 second contraction group is training with 9 sets, the 3 second contraction group is training with 5 sets, and the 9 second contraction group is training with 3 sets. Because if you think about it, if they're all doing 10 contractions per set and they're taking 7 seconds of rest between contractions, they're all taking these sort of different duration contractions for the same number of contractions per set, then your 1 second contraction group only has 10 total seconds of contraction, so they need to do 9 sets. Your 3 second group is getting 3 seconds of contraction doing 3 second contractions, and they're doing 10 of those, so they get 30 second sets. And your 9 second contraction group obviously is getting 90 seconds across the whole set, and so they only need to do a far fewer number of sets. So what you're doing is you're essentially experiencing an enormous amount of fatigue in your 9 second contraction group and very little fatigue in your 1 second contraction group on each set by set basis. And given that you're doing 3 minutes of rest between sets, it really kind of allows your 1 second group to get a lot of rest and avoid accumulating fatigue, whereas your 9 second group is really suffering quite a lot. I'm just going to pause there and check with Jake that is making sense to him before I carry on.
Yeah, it is. I'm trying to think if there's anything that needs clarification, but I think that's fairly straightforward. It's interesting there were 7 seconds between repetitions. That's quite a long time between those contractions.
Yeah, exactly. And that really kind of allows us to see that metabolite accumulation is probably not going to be a major problem in these situations. Yeah. Because obviously metabolites clear really, really quickly. So if you allow that rest period, like with clusters, if you give a cluster set scenario and you're giving 10 seconds maybe between repetitions, then that gives you a lot of time to clear metabolites, whereas other and spinal CN fatigue actually, whereas a lot of other mechanisms like the calcium ion stuff is just not going to be able to do anything in that short period of time.
Yeah. Now the rest periods, the contraction duration, all of that is similar to what we would see with humans. Yeah, like doing a 3 second or 9 second isometric, or taking 3 minutes off between sets, or doing sets of 10, that would be fairly standard for us to do. A second contraction in a mouse compared to a second contraction in a human, is that relatively equivalent?
Not really. So generally speaking, rodents have much more oxidative muscle fibers than we do. So they are going to clear fatigue much more successfully. But equally, we are dealing with electrical stimulation here. So you are dealing with pushing things up to the absolute maximal level. So you are getting into territory that a rodent typically wouldn't get into.
Mm-hmm.
So it swings and roundabouts, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, generally speaking, the smaller the animal, the more oxidative its muscle fibers, and the faster it's going to be able to deal with fatiguing mechanisms. So we've got these 3 training groups, and essentially they're aiming to produce, and they did actually produce, pretty much identical talk time integrals. But the longer the contraction duration, the longer the total time and the lower the average torque. So essentially, you're reducing the amount of torque that you're getting on average in any given contraction. And to compensate for that, you have to do a lot more contractions. So essentially, you're getting a lot more actual exercise time with maximal activation, but because of the force being lower in each of the muscle fibers that are working, you're having to do that in order to match the total torque time integral of the 1 second contraction group. So what I'm saying here is that your 1 second contraction group is getting the same torque time integral in a much shorter period of time than your 9 second contraction group. Yeah?
Yeah.
And this really strikes at the heart of some of the assumptions in some of the competing models that are starting to be formed for how hypertrophy works, because some people are arguing that torque time integral is what determines hypertrophy in a strength training context. So literally all of the reps in a strength training set they think are stimulating. So if I do a 30 rep max, they think all of those repetitions are somehow stimulating. And that what you're then doing is you're saying, you're just apportioning the stimulus across the entirety of the set. And you add all of that up and it somehow magically gets to the same stimulus that a 10 rep max would get to, or a 5 rep max would get to. What we're saying is that this study here, by showing that the hypertrophy is actually very different between these 3 groups, it's really high in the 1 second contraction group, it's lower in the 3 second contraction group, and it's very, very low in the 9 second contraction group. What it's showing is that this torque time integral does not determine hypertrophy of a strength training kind of workout or set. If you allow the fibers to produce higher forces and get your torque time integral mainly through force and not through time, then you get a strong hypertrophic response. If you try and compensate for your reduced force because of the reduced mechanical tension, you're going to end up, and then obviously compensate for that by doing a longer duration of repetitions, you actually get a worse effect. So put another way, if I translate this to a human strength training context, if you do 3 sets of say, 8 rep max, and you say leave 3 to 5 minutes between each of those sets, then you're going to get a strong hypertrophic response from that 3 sets of 8. You'll, of course, see a little bit of fatigue towards the end of each set, and you'll see a little bit of more fatigue from set 2 to set 3, but fundamentally you're getting a pretty strong hypertrophic response. In contrast, if you did that as a drop set and you did 3 sets of 8, but you had to drop the load going from set 1 to set 2 to set 3 because you're leaving no rest period between those things, essentially what you're going to get in that scenario is much, much reduced hypertrophic stimulus because of the fatigue mechanisms that are building up inside the muscle fibers, and actually in the human context in the central nervous system, because of course in this rodent model we are not allowing the central nervous system to get involved in the fatigue processes, but in obviously a human scenario we would see that. Essentially you are reducing the hypertrophic stimulus that those additional drops are producing in comparison with the 3 straight sets. So this is really, really important rodent study because it's showing us really clearly that fatigue mechanisms are having a negative impact on hypertrophy. And that's, for me, the critical part of this study, because I've been trying to educate people about the negative effects of fatigue for a very long time now in terms of hypertrophic scenarios. And while I think most people follow my logic, there are a group of hypertrophy researchers and their influencers who are really resisting that and are essentially trying to argue it doesn't happen. I think this is a extremely solid rodent study. Like I said, it's probably one of the 3 great rodent studies that is pushing to demonstrate that in a way that hypertrophy researchers just can't ignore any longer.
So you made a comment when you were contrasting it to what we would see in humans who would be doing something similar. And you mentioned that obviously in a human context, it's going to be central nervous system fatigue, which we're not seeing in this study, right? And
exactly.
So when you do something like a drop set that you've just explained, then obviously there's going to be central nervous system fatigue, and that's going to cause a reduction in motor unit recruitment. Now, in this scenario with the rodent study, there's not actually reduction in motor unit recruitment that's occurring, and yet there's still diminishing returns on hypertrophy.
Yep. So basically, all fatigue mechanisms, with the exception of a disruption in coordination, which is an artifact, all fatigue mechanisms are trying to do the same thing. Their purpose is identical, and that is to protect the muscle fibers from running out of ATP. And that's why a lot of people who come at fatigue mechanisms expecting to see fatigue being created by a loss of energy availability, they get unraveled in how fatigue works very quickly, and they get confused, because that's the opposite of what fatigue is doing. Fatigue is stopping you getting to that point. Fatigue is not caused by a loss of energy availability. Fatigue is actually stopping you getting to the point where you're losing energy availability, or at least at the ATP level. You can lose energy availability at the glycogen level. That's totally doable. You're never going to lose it at the ATP level. So ultimately, CNS fatigue mechanisms are stopping you activating the fiber in the first place, whether they're at the supraspinal or spinal levels. They just stop you activating the fiber. And that basically means that you don't use any ATP because the fiber is not activated. You can't really use ATP very effectively unless the fiber is activated. Calcium ion-related fatigue mechanisms are like the next link in the chain. If the fiber is activated, then you can either switch it off at the cell membrane level with cell membrane kind of losses of excitability, and that can happen for a number of reasons, but primarily, I think the main reason is it gets damaged. You can lose it at the electrochemical junction, the triadic junction, which is what is technically referred to as excitation, contraction, coupling failure. Or you could lose it at the sensitivity level. You could lose it from actin losing sensitivity to the presence of calcium ions. So you can lose the ability to respond to the presence of an activated fiber. But again, by losing those losing the ability to activate the internal part of the fiber, even though there's an activation on the external part of the fiber, means you can't create cross bridges. If you can't create cross bridges, you can't use ATP. And if you stop the flow earlier than that, you can actually stop excitation, contraction, coupling happening, and that uses a lot of ATP. So ultimately, all of this stuff is really just stopping you from using ATP. Now, the reason I'm setting this context is because if you use electrical stimulation and you just kind of move everything one step down and you say, okay, we can't use CNS fatigue mechanisms now, it doesn't change anything. It just means that now your calcium ion-related fatigue mechanisms, as I call them, are now going to be entirely responsible for protecting you, and they are just going to go to the max in order to try and make that happen. You're just going to push them to the point when they do as much as they can possibly do in order to stop you running out of ATP. So you're just magnifying the effect of calcium ion-related fatigue. So really, from a kind of experimental design perspective, all that's going to be different is that you are going to move the limiting factor one step down from the CNS to the calcium ion fatigue mechanisms. So people are going, oh, no, now this experiment is irrelevant. You can't use this to translate to humans. Yes, you can, because the CNS fatigue mechanisms do exactly what the calcium ion mechanisms are doing, except one step up the chain. They just stop you using the fiber. The only thing that's going to differ is that, because the fibers get switched off in both cases, so you're reducing tension in both cases. It doesn't matter. The end result from a hypertrophy point of view is identical. The end result from a muscle damage point of view is completely different. so like if you're using obviously CNS fatigue mechanisms to switch the fibers off, you're not going to get the same post-workout fatigue because you're not going to get the calcium ion influx. If you were to use this study and say, oh, well, what was the muscle damage result? Then you get a completely different answer, because your CNS fatigue is protecting you not only from running out of ATP, but it's also protecting you from the calcium ion influx creating muscle damage after the workout. So you wouldn't be able to use this study to say, well, how does post-workout fatigue work? Because you are not experiencing the same kind of stimulus for post-workout fatigue if you haven't got any CNS fatigues. If you lose the access to CNS fatigues, then you are essentially not protected as much as if you have still got those. So, but from a hypertrophy point of view, switching which part of the planet my brain is in right now, whether I'm thinking in English or American English. So depending on which depending on the question we're asking. If we're asking about fatigue, then we can't really map this. But if we're asking about hypertrophy, then we can map it perfectly, because all that's happening is that the fibers are being switched off higher or lower in the sequence before they actually get the chance to produce mechanical tension. And it's the mechanical tension that's obviously stimulating hypertrophy, because that's what we talked about at the very beginning when I said, there's been the classic rodent study that we saw in 2016 that shows that tension is the driver of hypertrophy on a single fiber level.
Your comment about CNS fatigue protecting you from the muscle damage, that's something we've highlighted in the past, where I've mentioned some of the ridiculous workouts we see in the golden era with some of the insane amounts of volume. In some ways, some of those very short rest periods and high repetitions are having a protective effect because they're causing such a high amount of this CNS fatigue that it's mitigating at least some of that damage than if the fatigue mechanisms weren't there.
Yeah, totally. If you're out of breath or if your muscles are burning, then those two things are going to be using RPE that you can't dedicate towards central motor command. So yeah, I mean, I see this still. I mean, I literally was in the gym yesterday and there was a guy training sitting next to me, and he was literally really breathing very, very hard during his sets. He was absolutely blowing like a train. And that is going to be using RPE that he is not dedicating towards the motor unit recruitment signal. So it's going to reduce the number of activated fibers. I mean, that has a negative effect on hypertrophy because you're not getting the fibers available to train. But of course, it also then protects you because you're not getting the muscle damage.
So in both of these scenarios, if you do have CNS fatigue that's there and basically stopping the activation, compared to in this rodent study where the CNS fatigue wasn't interfering and then it was more calcium ion-related fatigue mechanisms, in both of those, if we were to actually able to look at muscle fiber hypertrophy, we're going to see that the hypertrophy that that group experienced, reduction in hypertrophy in that rodent study, it would be coming from muscle fibers that would be higher up in the high threshold motor unit pool, wouldn't it? They're going to be affected more so.
Correct. So both CNS fatigue or all CNS fatigue mechanisms work top down. So basically, they start by reducing your access to the highest threshold motor units, and they work downwards. And the purpose of that is to avoid the glycolytic fibers at the top end of the motor unit pool being stripped of all their ATP. So that's how it is designed to work. Calcium ion-related fatigue mechanisms inadvertently work in exactly the same way because they are going to be most prevalent in fibers with minimal mitochondria, because mitochondria are the first line of defense against calcium ion accumulation. So if you've got fibers at the top end of the motor unit pool, in there being activated by electrical stimulation, then the mitochondria are going to give up very quickly in those fibers because there aren't very many of them and they're weaker than the mitochondria in the slow twitch fibers that are low threshold motor units. And so ultimately they're going to experience those calcium ion-related fatigue mechanisms very, very rapidly. So irrespective of whether you're doing this is what I'm saying, from a system point of view, CNS fatigues and calcium ion-related fatigues are doing pretty much the same thing.
The same function, yeah.
As far as the muscle, as long as we're talking about hypertrophy and not muscle damage, then they are literally doing exactly the same thing. So from this study's point of view, where people are going to be like, oh, well, it's electrical stimulation, I can ignore it. It's a rodent study, I can ignore it. I'm like, you don't understand how fatigue mechanisms work. If you actually work through the things that the processes that are working in this situation, you can actually just map this perfectly across something like drop sets in humans.
Yeah. So
But what you can't do, and just coming back to the contextual remark I made at the beginning of this section, you cannot say, oh, so this is like saying that I shouldn't do slow repetitions, I shouldn't slow down my rep. No, if you slow down your rep in a strength training set, you are reducing motor unit recruitment to do that. That's the only way we've got of doing that action. If you say to me, oh, I'm going to slow down my repetition and do like 4-second lifting phases, I'm like, the only way you can do that is by reducing your effort level, which is reducing recruitment, and you're changing the recruitment that the muscle fibers are experiencing. Now you're not comparing like with like anymore. The two scenarios are totally different.
So why someone who's just listened to you explain this study, and they might be asking, well, hang on, I'm not doing isometrics. I'm not doing 9-second isometrics and doing 10 repetitions.
Probably not even doing drop sets either. Yes. So how is this relevant?
Yeah.
So what it also tells us is that any rep that's done with a maximum level of effort and a maximum, in this stimulating rep model, we say that any repetition that's done with max recruitment and high mechanical tension is a stimulating rep. Now, you can drop one level down from that. So the beginning, a stimulating rep is high recruitment plus high mechanical tension. That's the axiomatic basis of stimulating rep theory. You can't have transverse hypertrophy, increase in myofibril number, without both high recruitment and high mechanical tension. Drop down one level. What does that mean in practice? It means that you need a high level of effort to map to high levels of recruitment, and also a slow movement velocity to map to the high mechanical tension. Okay, so those are our two practical implications. Why can't we just say that all the time? Why can't I just say that a stimulating rep is high effort plus slow movement velocity? I can't say it for two reasons. One, I can't say it because a high level of effort doesn't always mean maximum levels of motor unit recruitment, because I can have a high effort that comes from other sources of RPE. I can feel RPE if I'm breathing hard, like the gentleman sitting next to me in the gym yesterday. I can feel RPE if I've got metabolite burning sensations in the muscles, like we were talking about with golden era bodybuilders. So I can have sensations that are adding to my effort perception that don't actually give me the high recruitment, because they're chewing up RPE that I would use for recruitment if I had it available, but I don't, because I'm dedicating it to these sources of pain and suffering instead. So I can't map high effort perfectly to motor unit recruitment. This goes back to a debate that has been going on a long time, whereby every so often I say that, doing light loads to failure doesn't actually hit max levels of recruitment. And I suddenly get all the screeches from the fitness influencers shouting, yes, it does, yes, it does, yes, it does. And then I dig out all the data and I show people again, and then they all go quiet. And it's literally, that's what's happening in that scenario. You've got an effort perception coming from something else that is then pushing a discrepancy between motor unit recruitment levels and effort levels. What we're seeing here is an identical situation on the tension side. If I've got a slow velocity, like an isometric contraction or the end of a strength training set, do I automatically therefore also have a high level of mechanical tension in that single fiber? No, I can have calcium amylase fatigue mechanisms that are reducing the tension inside the fiber, and now I can have a slow movement velocity without a high level of mechanical tension stimulating hypertrophy. So what we're seeing then is that we've got our end goal here for stimulating rep theory, which is high recruitment and high mechanical tension per fiber. Drop down one level and go, usually a high effort should map to a high level of recruitment, but it doesn't if you've got a fatigue mechanism in the CNS. And here again, we're doing the same thing, just one level down. We're going, okay, now slow movement velocity doesn't always map perfectly to a high level of mechanical tension on the fiber level if I have calcium ion-related fatigue mechanisms. That's it. That's the essence of what we're saying here today.
Yeah.
I
think that's a really good summary, I guess, of what this adds to the narrative, because you hear people say things like, oh, it's all about hard sets, right? I think that's the language they use. It's, however many hard sets one does. And as you've just explained there, and obviously there's other issues here with that terminology, but a hard set is not equating for fatigue.
For the purpose of people listening to the podcast, that was Jake responding to the expression on my face.
So we've acknowledged that there's an issue with recruitment if fatigue mechanisms are at play, but we haven't generally acknowledged that there could be an issue here with mechanical tension with fatigue mechanisms at play. So that's really interesting that we're saying actually both of these two, variables that we need, they're both impacted by fatigue mechanisms.
Correct. Exactly. And that then has huge implications for how we program strength training. Now, again, anybody who's been following the work that I've been doing over the last few years on fatigue will not be surprised by anything I'm about to say. All we're doing is just integrating this new finding into the evidence base that shows that what I've been saying is in fact a good map. If one of my favorite examples, if you look at the dose response of hypertrophy to training volume, you get a nonlinear curve. That nonlinear curve is quite pronounced. If we use the Schoenfeld meta-analysis and we apply a natural logarithm to the data presented in that meta-analysis, what we see is that, broadly speaking, you're getting maybe like 40%. I forget the number off the top of my head, maybe like 40%. People can correct me. I don't remember numbers off the top of my head like this. And maybe like 60% if we do 3 sets. So kind of going up relatively in small amounts from the 100% of a one set stimulus. But the point is, it's nonlinear. You're not getting, kind of double the amount of hypertrophy by doing 2 sets compared to 1 set. It's very, very much reduced in that second set, and again, reduced even further for the third set. And again and again and again as you go increasing, and it becomes pretty minimal after 5 sets or so, how much extra you get. So a very, very non-linear kind of curve. And I've published what I think the estimates are in various different places. So don't listen to my numbers right now. Look at the numbers that I've actually written on a chart when I've been thinking about it. So the point here, though, is that if we look at the eccentric training literature, you don't get the same dose-response curve. The dose-response curve stops at around about 3 sets. It kind of goes up and then it just kind of plateaus. And what that's showing us is that in eccentric contractions, where you're getting a ton more calcium ion accumulation, your ability to actually continue stimulating hypertrophy later on in the workout just tanks to almost zero. Wonderful illustration of exactly what we've just been talking about in the last sort of 20, 30 minutes or so, that if you have, chucked a load of calcium ions into your muscle fiber to an extent that it's produced calcium ion fatigue mechanisms, you're not going to get any more hypertrophy in that workout, no matter how much more work you do. The same thing would then apply to doing a load of stretch position strength training before you wanted to do something else. So this is why I talk about exercise order being important. If you're doing multiple exercises for the same muscle group, classic example being leg press and the knee extension, most people are going to do the leg press and then do the knee extension. That makes no sense, because if you do the stretch position exercise first, you're going to have the calcium ion accumulation, you're going to have the calcium ion fatigue, you're not going to get much more value out of the knee extension, which is generally a contracted position exercise. So again, mapping really well to exercise order, with the calcium ion fatigue mechanisms playing a major role. But fundamentally, you can also then use it to explain the basic dose response analysis. Why do we get a nonlinear response? It's because your later sets have got some calcium ion accumulation. And again, do we then take measures to try and avoid that problem earlier on in the workout? Should I be training to failure on every single one of my sets if I'm doing multiple sets to failure? Or should I actually give myself a rep in reserve on that earlier set? Interestingly, this kind of would push you, if you were planning on doing different rep ranges. I mean, one really interesting progression model is to do one slightly heavier set and follow it up by a slightly lighter set. That way round makes a lot more sense than doing the lighter set first.
So it's not that the lighter set is giving you anything additional, but you're contrasting that to starting with a lighter set and then doing a heavier set. If you do the lighter set to failure.
So like you can see 2 scenarios. The person who does a heavy set and leaves 1 rep in reserve and then follows it up with a back off set with a lighter weight to failure. So let's say they do a 6 or a 7 rep max and leave a 1 rep in reserve, and then they do a 12 rep max, but they train to failure. That way around is way better than doing the 12 rep max to failure followed by 6 rep max, 7 rep max, leaving a rep in reserve. Because what we're doing there is we're aiming to minimize the calcium ion accumulation earlier in the workout so that we keep our single fiber tension higher for longer. In the same way that I would say to somebody, don't gas yourself completely with some kind of really tiring, cardiovascularly demanding exercise at the beginning of the workout, and then crawl through the rest of your workout, with zero ability to produce motor unit recruitment because your RPE is being chewed up by the cardiovascular sensations. In the same way, we don't want to dump calcium ions into the muscle fibers in the first set of a workout and then try and somehow create a benefit from the same muscle group in later sets. It's just not going to happen. That's literally what this rodent study is showing us. You can't just ignore fatigue mechanisms and expect that you can get the same result from a set with high effort and slow movement velocity. It's just not going to happen.
So are there any other ways that you would be conscious of setting up a training routine to be consistent with what you said there? So, you've obviously mentioned it makes more sense to do the lower repetitions first, and then if you're going to do a back off set, do it that way rather than starting with high repetitions and then going to lower. You've mentioned using stretch positions second and doing the shortened position first. I would just quickly add to that, I do personally tend to do squats before my leg extensions because I do my squats with very low repetitions, and with a stack on a leg extension, I have to do about 15 plus repetitions. So for me in that condition, I find it makes more sense to do it in that order, but it's going to depend on that person, right? So, there's always going to be variables that you may or may not be able to control, and there's going to be different things that's going to affect. So you need to be thinking for yourself in your own context, what's going to make the most sense here. What other variables, I guess, might
I mean,
someone...
yeah, you're picking the lesser of two evils, aren't you? I
Yes,
mean,
yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah,
neither of the scenarios is optimal, but you're just
no,
picking
exactly.
the
Neither's ideal.
least
I
bad,
could gym
least
pin
bad.
it, but yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, if we kind of start from the premise that something like a drop set is going to be about the worst way of training, then by definition, the opposite of that could be interesting to explore. And clusters are essentially the opposite of doing a kind of rest, not a rest pause, sorry. They're the opposite of doing a drop set type routine. Obviously, that cluster has to be a heavy load cluster. You can't just do clusters with a moderate load like a 10 rep max and expect something interesting to happen, because you're not actually a stimulating rep when you start. So it has to be a heavy load cluster. So you have to be using a 5 rep max. But 5 rep max weights done with like single or double repetitions could be a really interesting way of training once we understand that these fatigue mechanisms are having really, really meaningful effects on the reduced hypertrophy stimulus that we're getting.
So in that context, when we've talked about clusters in the past, and I think we've done at least one, maybe two podcasts where we've talked about them, we've talked about the example of using like a 5 rep max load. You do a single, maybe you wait 30 seconds or so between the repetitions. And we've talked about it largely in the context of mitigating some of that more like spinal and supraspinal CNS fatigue. Now, based on what we're talking about here with calcium ion fatigue, would that change that sort of rest period between the cluster, or what we've talked about there would still apply?
I think that in human scenarios of voluntary contractions, the CNS fatigues are going to be doing most of the work.
Yeah.
I think that the reason we're seeing so much calcium ion fatigue in this rodent study is simply because there wasn't an ability to create it. Yeah. But you would basically just trigger it at a higher level because it's far better for the body to do it that way. You don't want a lot of calcium ion fatigue because you're going to suffer horrible consequences in the post-workout period if you do. So I think, honestly, we're still targeting CNS fatigues in a human perspective, and spinal CNS fatigue dissipates really quickly. Supraspinal fatigue and non-linearly, so you get a huge benefit as soon as you take your kind of weight off. You're immediately starting to recover incredibly rapidly from the spinal CNS fatigue. So I think really 10, 20 seconds, 30 seconds is an enormous amount of time from a spinal CNS fatigue point of view. From a supraspinal fatigue point of view, you're really looking for sensations. And people ask me questions about this all the time. And I'm like, are you living in your body? Are you actually aware of what you're experiencing? Can you feel, can you detect your breathing rate? Can you
you're getting the feedback to know this for yourself. Yeah.
You should know this stuff. Like you must be living in your body. You're not living somewhere else. You're not a computer game sprite. You must be able to detect this stuff, like feel it. If you're doing like squats, then you're going to find that you're going to need a lot more rest between sets because you're going to be breathing hard. You're going to have that blood lactate response that's going to provoke a cardiovascular response after every single repetition. If you're doing, kind of biceps curls, not really, but you might be getting metabolite accumulation there. So you've got to be aware of that. So you've got to be aware of the sensations. And even if you're not getting those, but you're getting some other disagreeable sensation, then be aware of that as well, because that's probably not a good exercise for you to do that particular cluster protocol on. What you're looking for is a cluster. If you want to do clusters and experiment with them in this context, you need something where you can comfortably do like heavy load singles or doubles. And then like what you're looking for is any disagreeable sensations to die away over 10 seconds or so. Perfect, and then do another repetition. If you're in a scenario where it's uncomfortable, it's painful, it's giving you long duration, like disagreeable sensations, like for me, I wouldn't be able to do this with squats. I would be absolutely gassed after a handful of reps. It just wouldn't work for me at all. I think there'd be other scenarios where it would work a lot better, but I think everybody's going to be different. But fundamentals don't change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be very exercise dependent. With a squat, the last thing I would want to do is do that with an actual barbell squat. I don't know if
Sure.
people
I
have
mean,
tried
we're
doing that.
obviously talking about like pendulum squat type.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can, if you're skilled and you've got very good kind of setup with the rack. I mean, like when I was doing a lot of powerlifting style squatting, I was very attuned to exactly where my barbell was
Yeah.
and where my rack was. And I could literally just lean forward very slightly and it would be on the pins.
Yes. Yeah. Or
So,
you've got like a monolift or something, like,
or
depending
yeah,
on the equipment
exactly.
you've got.
I mean, like if you've got the access to this kind of stuff, then you can do it with a barbell. But like if obviously you've got a pendulum squat or something, or a hack squat, or you've got the system machines in place, it's a lot easier.
Yes.
You don't have to worry about that like re-racking process or anything like that. But
same with the
just
bench. I wouldn't want to do this with the bench press. You could do it with the chest press machine.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's going to fit machines a lot better. But again, maybe people are going to struggle to be able to do heavy loads with machines. Most people are going to be working moderate loads with machines just because unless they've got gym pins or other ways of making the stack heavier, it's going to be very tricky for them to be working in that zone.
So based off this study, to me, it sounds like the shorter intervals of a maximally stimulating repetitions we can do more often, the better. So if we were to do, say, many sets of a single, I mean, I guess sort of like what we just said there with the cluster, but it sounds like potentially lower repetition, maximally stimulating rep sets for more sets could be better than high repetition sets.
But ultimately, that fits perfectly with just the like knowledge that we've gained over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, which is that short rest periods aren't very clever for hypertrophy purposes. I think what we're seeing here is another step in that direction of moving forward from the short rest period data and saying not only are short rest periods between sets not very clever, but allowing your set to drag on, way past the point of being effective is not very clever either. So honestly, I don't think that this study changes anything for me because ultimately it just kind of adds more weight of evidence to the argument that I've been making consistently for the last few years. What it does, I think, is push that idea right up into the hypertrophy researchers' faces. This is a hypertrophy study. All of the studies that I've been working off the last kind of however many years have all been fatigue physiology studies. And I just keep bringing the fatigue physiology. Hypertrophy researchers just keep going, I'm not interested, not interested, not interested. This is now a hypertrophy study that's showing exactly the same thing. And that's a game changer because now it's a study in their literature body that they're interested in reading, and it proves the point that I've been making all along, which is that fatigue mechanisms are negative for hypertrophy, not positive.
Well, actually, maybe let me restate my statement or question in that term there. So essentially what we want is as many of our maximally stimulating repetitions as possible to be done in an unfatigued state. And so
Hang on a minute. So terminology.
Yep.
So from my point of view, a stimulating rep is high recruitment and high tension. So what you just said there was technically not possible because if it's a stimulating rep, then it must have axiomatically high recruitment and high tension.
Yes, but there's a continuous.
You want all of your high effort, slow velocity reps to be done in low states of fatigue.
Well, so if we were to say a set of 5, so a set of 5, we're going to agree that is all maximally stimulating. But there's going to be more fatigue.
It's not like we're having an argument. So, but this ties back to something that you pointed out before we jumped on the podcast today, which is that this observation that you're now homing in on could actually explain the study that we last did as a study review on this podcast. Because this is only the second study that we've done a full review of. Not that we've done a full review, but
look at
this
you
is only
remembering things about our podcast.
I occasionally remember things, and that was a study that actually I was quite interested in. So I do remember that we covered it as a topic. My increasing decline into old age is becoming a meme on the internet. Actually, people write to me and say you're forgetting stuff and you can't remember what you're saying in the middle of a sentence. I'm like, yeah, I know that's what happens when you get old. Yeah, The last study we actually reviewed, and the only other study that we've reviewed on this podcast, was the study regarding heavy loads producing similar hypertrophy to moderate loads in a long-term strength training program in humans, which was radical because prior to that, we'd never really got anything heavier than about an 8 rep max-ish. So it was kind of really kind of important. It also starts to indicate that, maybe there is a possible benefit of heavy loads that goes above and beyond just the number of stimulating reps. And this study would fit perfectly into that category because, as you rightly point out, if I'm doing a 5 rep max or if I'm starting to do singles with 5 rep maxes, I might actually get more stimulating effect from doing that than doing sets of moderate loads to failure and getting ostensibly what looks like 5 stimulating reps, but the actual stimulus of those stimulating reps in inverted commas isn't actually as high as the stimulation that I'm getting from singles with heavier loads. And this study is pushing us in that direction. It's literally just fatigue mechanisms.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the rhetoric is obviously that what's best for hypertrophy. I mean, most people nowadays will say anything from a set of 5 to 30, but technically speaking, based on this, you could say, well, potentially even those sets of fewer than 5 repetitions on a rep by rep basis, those repetitions might even be more stimulating compared to a single rep in that set of 5.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the people who are saying that, hypertrophy is identical between 5 and 30 reps, as long as you're doing the same number of sets to failure, are abstract readers, aren't they? I mean, they're not going any deeper than that.
Sure,
I
but
mean,
that is the general narrative.
Yeah, sure. But you can find probably 100, if not 1,000 influencers on the internet who will say that, who have no idea where that knowledge has come from.
Yes.
I mean, drop down a level and start kicking around the mechanisms of how that works, and you start to see that there's got to be variability in there somewhere. And indeed, there is variability in that, as we talked about when we did the last study review. But yeah, I mean, I think you could get to a point where you're like, is it worth trying to build programs for hypertrophy around the idea of doing heavy singles with 5 rep maxes or heavy doubles with 5 rep maxes? I think there's definitely something worth exploring in that. Personally, I think you're going to lose something on the progressive overload side and the motivation side. But if you're able to, like you actually wrote a program a while back where you had an A/B split, and one of the workouts was progressive overload based, where you had an actual rep max that you were trying to push forwards, and the other workout was a cluster workout where you didn't have any interest in actually pushing anything forward. You were just getting volume in for that protocol, and that could be awesome in this context of what we're talking about here today, because you're getting the progressive overload and pushing things forwards and getting the feedback that you're making progress, but at the same time you're actually getting this what could be a very elegant way of maximizing the hypertrophic stimulus in a workout. And also, incidentally, I mean, this has been not really highlighted as we've gone through this, I have mentioned it. If you minimize calcium ion-related fatigue during a workout, that minimizes post-workout fatigue as well. So if you go into a workout going, I want to get the maximum stimulus in each stimulating rep, so we're going to end up having to grade stimulating reps at this point. But if I want to get that automatically minimizes your post-workout fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, for quite a long time, I thought that probably the best way to train for hypertrophy would be largely what a lot of powerlifters do, but just change the exercise selection. You talked about a Hepburn method with Rob on your other podcast, and something like that. You're getting very stimulating repetitions. You're doing your sets of 2, 3, 4 repetitions with a 5, 6 max rep load. It kind of makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think it starts to make higher numbers of exercises challenging.
It does. And that's why I tend to combine them. So I often will do multi-sets on one exercise for muscle, where we might do fewer than 5 repetitions. And then so it might be, say, 2 sets of I think one of my groups at the moment, we're doing 2 sets of 3 to 4 repetitions. And then the second exercise, we're doing a single set with a set of 10. So instead of that back off set for that same exercise, we're getting in a different exercise and kind of doing that back off set idea, but with a different exercise and set. But, to your point, it does become challenging if you're having to set up very heavy loads, you're having to do warm-up sets. It's hard to justify doing that for a single set of very low repetitions.
but that is, certainly something I think that could be experimented with. I mean, the thing about the science-based lifting community is that they are generally quite open-minded and curious, and they are happy to experiment with all kinds of interesting ideas. And it'll be interesting to see if they are able to experiment with this and take it in directions that produce us interesting results. And one of the interesting things that comes out of their experimentations is that they very quickly start to arrive at practical ways of doing things, because they're inventing on the fly of how to make something happen. So very quickly you get from, like a year ago or 2 years ago, the availability of options for stabilization during strength training exercises with cables was almost non-existent. You literally, I still go in the gym and I see some poor guy trying to do some exercise with a cable, and he's got his feet on the ground, and that is the only point of stability he's got between him and the cable that he's trying to do some kind of, shoulder exercise with. And of course, the load that he's able to move is just tiny because his feet are the only point of contact with any sort of external surface. But now you see people on TikTok with all kinds of elaborate stabilization pieces of equipment that have even not just pieces of equipment that they've kind of made themselves, but they're actually now available to them. They can buy. So in the space of a very short period of time, we've seen some incredibly fast movement in improving stability and therefore increasing motor unit recruitment in specific situations. So I think it's a lot of people give the science-based lifting community a lot of criticism, and I think they just don't understand what they're trying to do. I think they think from looking outside, because bodybuilding has over the last sort of 30, 40 years, and this is obviously post Silver era, but in the last sort of 30, 40 years, bodybuilding has developed very strong kind of group membership trends. So it has very strong trends and conventions around the kind of clothes that people wear, the kind of training that people do, the kind of language that people do, and how they describe things, how they talk about set, how they talk about reps, how they talk about what they're doing before and after the gym. There's lots of very strong group membership type trends. And so when those people look at the science-based lifting community, they expect to see the same thing. They look at them and they go, where are your trends? Where are your kind of language, habitual usages? What am I expecting to see? And those do exist, but that's not really what the community is trying to do as a base kind of purpose. Their purpose really is experimental. That's what they are trying. That's the thing that actually gets them thinking and going to the gym and doing stuff. And it's not just belonging to a group and going and doing the sets and the reps and what have you. It's actually creating new ways of doing things and solving problems based on an understanding of how physiologically muscles are actually responding to exercise. So I think that when people criticize that group, they're criticizing it from a fundamental misunderstanding of what they're trying to do. I'm not kind of like trying to say that I'm, defending them as a group. I'm just saying people are misunderstanding how they're thinking.
Yeah, they feel like symbolic arguments against the community. I don't entirely understand them a lot of the time, because usually it's rooted in this sort of idea of, well, no one ever used to do that, but a lot of the time people did used to do that if you go far enough back. And, one of my favorite criticisms is at the moment, a lot of people are criticizing the use of stability devices like seatbelts. And they're saying how stupid to use a seatbelt on a machine and, for stability purposes. But, I've shared this online, like there's photos of Reg Park getting people to sit on him, literally hang off him in machines, in lat pull downs for stability. Yeah. It's like, well, you don't see science-based lifters walking around going to a lat pull down, get someone to sit in the lap. They'd be made fun of today. But Reg Park was doing this, 75 years ago. So it's an odd argument to be like, oh, this is just a new invention and it's a TikTok phase or whatever. Well, no, actually the best bodybuilders before anabolics were all aware that stability mattered. And, these variables that people are trying to problem solve now matter.
But that point that you just made there, it's a phase, it's a TikTok phase. That, again, actually is starting from the point of view of a settled, established group with its own existing habits and usages that have solidified. The science-based community is not trying to really do that. The science-based living community is actually rooted in experimental kind of practices. It's like if somebody's looking at the science-based lifting community from outside and they're seeing everything changing all the time, they're not going to understand why that is if they start from their perspective, which is that a group should have established kind of practices and ways of doing things that identify them as a group. If they then look at the science-based lifting community and go, why are these guys changing everything all the time from week to week? And they go, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it doesn't make sense because you don't understand what they're trying to do. It's experimenting with stuff to try and figure things out and find ways of solving problems that are presented to you by how physiology actually works. Physiology isn't changing, but the experimental side of it is how to match the practical processes with that physiology. And that's what will look very strange from the outside because people are essentially, you've got a marketplace of ideas of all these people trying to solve ways of gaining stability, of maximizing whatever thing they're trying to maximize. It could be that they're trying to isolate, or not isolate, but target one particular area of a muscle. And so they're moving the resistance profile around all over the place by doing things. They're changing, how the exercise is done in other aspects or whatever they're doing. But fundamentally, it's experimental. And people who are coming from the perspective expecting a group to be settled are not going to understand that. It's just going to look weird. And if you understand how groups work and how group dynamics work, it's really interesting to just see those disconnects between people who are coming from the outside and looking at them going, I don't understand this. Well, yeah, you don't, because you're applying your template of what a group should look like to this group, and they're not trying to achieve what your group is trying to achieve.
Before we conclude, I do need to ask, and hopefully this isn't a can of worms like my question to you last week was, but there might be people who've listened to this study that you've explained and now questioning, well, hang on, what do I do if I was performing isometrics? Because we've talked in the past about doing isometrics and we've talked about doing, 5 to 10 seconds. And we've just said here that in this rodent study, the 9-second isometric was far inferior to these shorter isometric contractions. Does that change the way someone should be performing isometrics?
So obviously the context in which the 9-second isometrics is having a negative effect is when you're doing 10 of them in a row.
Without spinal fatigue that's inhibiting.
And you haven't got the CNS fatigues that are kind of protecting you to a certain extent. I mean, they're obviously going to have the same negative effect from a hypertrophy point of view, but they're not going to have a kind of post-workout fatigue impact. I think I've been reasonably consistent in asking people to target 5-second isometrics. I don't think, because that ultimately is the MVC kind of standard. It's the one we use for testing maximum strength. I think 3 to 5 seconds is pretty solid zone to get maximal force output. I think that drifting higher than that towards 10 seconds is fine if you're not going to do lots and lots of repetitions. If you're going to do 2 or 3 repetitions, I think up to 10 seconds is probably okay. But honestly, I would probably still personally prefer splitting that into 2 5s, doing double the number of total contractions and doing them as 5 seconds. Really, it's the people who are sort of going off the top end of 10 seconds and doing 20-second isometrics that are going to be the people that are creating problems for themselves. I mean, I think 10 seconds is probably still just about okay as long as you're not doing a whole bunch of them.
Some of these things bring back bad memories for me.
Not to rub it up.
No. Okay, good. Well, I've done like 30-second isometrics in the past, even when I was talking about Zottman curls. I remember back in the day, we used to do, I think it was 100 Zottman curls to finish our arms workout. Like, man, some of the stupid stuff that I've done or that people do today. But there we go. Okay. 5 to 10-second isometrics. Would you say when someone does an isometric, is there, you're not going to be getting max effort immediately, right? Like there might be about a second, would you say, until there's max voluntary activation. So if you're doing, like, say you were to do a 3-second isometric, maybe that's a little bit on the short side.
Well, voluntary activation depends on how you're approaching the isometric. So in a bodybuilding context, generally speaking, we probably wouldn't go absolutely sort of max effort from the very start of the contraction. You do see that in some sporting contexts where people kind of try to produce max effort from straight out the gate, and that's a separate context. But personally, if I'm kind of thinking about or programming or even attempting max effort isometrics, there is no scenario in the world that I'm going to start with max effort straight out of the gate. I'm just not going to do that. It makes no sense from an injury prevention point of view. So I'm going to start building force, and it's going to take me a second or two to build to max force. And that's just how I feel more comfortable doing them. And I think unless you're an athlete in using isometrics for a very specific athletic purpose, I would always do them in that way. So yeah, you are going to need a solid 5 seconds in that scenario, and you're probably only going to get 3 true max effort, like max mechanical tension kind of seconds in that scenario. So again, if you wanted to push that up to 7, so you get full kind of 5 seconds, that would make sense. But again, we're talking about somewhere between kind of 3 and 10 seconds. We're not talking about anything longer than that. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, great. Okay, so clusters, isometrics, lower repetition sets potentially. Anything else we covered? I think that were the key ones.
Reps and reserve.
Reps and reserve,
Exercise order, stretch positions. I mean, ultimately, none of this is new to anybody who's kind of looked through the FAQ, followed what we've been saying, and understands how calcium amylase fatigue works. That's really all it is. And if you want to map it perfectly to humans, you're going to need to have the supraspinal and spinal CNS fatigues on as well. But fundamentally, it doesn't really change that much.
Great. Perfect. Well, thank you guys for listening. Join us again next week for probably not a study, maybe not our third study review. Who knows? It might be. We don't know what's going to come out, but for another interesting topic.